welcome to Sturgis. There are a lot of you. We knew there was going to be a good amount, but not this many. So, thank you for coming. Before we get going on this, we have a bunch of random things we'd like to tell you. The first is there's the fire exit. The other is there's a fire exit on the front and a fire exit at the back. Next, restrooms.
Will the thing go off if you push?
No, you're good. Restrooms, there's one in the children's room, and then there's one next to the stairs back there. So if you need them, that's where they are. On the table back there, you'll find a bunch of alcohol and 2 pieces of pie. There are 2 pieces left. If you want the pie, yeah, right. That's your only chance. There's also a jar for donations. We always make this little spiel at events. Sturgis, like all the other libraries in Barnstable, we are 60% privately funded, 40% town funded. All the different libraries have to essentially make up the rest of that budget. And that budget goes to having programs like this and getting all the good books on the shelves and paying for my job. So, if you feel kind
and paying the speakers handsomely.
But if you feel like donating, it's back there. But once again, libraries are meant to be a free resource to the public. So if you don't feel like it, that's cool. If you can't do it, no worries. We want to be here for you guys and whatever you need. There's also a sign up for the newsletter underneath Greg's dry ice thing back there.
I'm a little disappointed in the dry ice. But let the record reflect there is dry ice.
Yes. Imagine fog and smoke and stuff. So that's there. There's a couple of water.
Oh, I did. Yeah.
So there's a couple of events coming up I'd like you to know about. In the next month or so, on November 13th, there's going to be a program called Mary Chilton Winslow, the Survivor of the Mayflower at 6:30. Joyce Prince, one of our awesome patrons, is going to come and give a lecture on that. On November 20th, we're going to have a World War II in the South Pacific lecture. That'll also be at 6:30. On November 27th, there's the Voices of Poetry to End All Wars event. That's going to be at 6 on November 27th, as I said. That'll be both poetry and music. That'll be pretty cool. And then finally, on December 12th at 6 p.m., there's going to be a publishing and editing panel with Claire Polders, Daniel Priestley, and myself. And we're going to tell you all sorts of stuff about how to publish your novel, memoir, short story, play, screenplay, Gothic romance, whatever you want.
But with no dry ice. Right?
With no dry ice. Don't have the budget for that. And lastly, Greg goes all around Cape Cod and does these awesome lectures. He does them on all sorts of different topics, does true crime, does local history, famous court cases, and he likes dark stuff, as you will know tonight. But there's one specific coming up on Sunday, November 11th at 4 p.m. at the 717 Meeting House. It's Battle Lines, Poetry and Music of World War II. World War I, I can't read numerals.
1, 2, you know.
Well, no, go ahead.
There's going to be war and poetry, yay! But seriously,
you're doing the introductions next time.
Right.
Go ahead.
If you want to stay up to date with that, though, Greg has a Facebook page, and he puts all of his events on there, so you can always stay tuned to what Greg is doing. If you want to stalk him a little bit, it's okay. Yeah, right? And so beyond that, Greg is going to start talking now. That's basically his intro.
No, just on this, if I could, this is touting this event really more than some of the others that I do because it's me and Jacqueline Schwab. If you know Jacqueline Schwab, or you don't know Jacqueline Schwab by name, you probably know her music. If you have seen any of the earlier Ken Burns films, she does the piano for 12 of them, including the Civil War. So the reason to come to this is really to hear Jacqueline Schwab play the piano because she's just unbelievable. It's really something to see and hear because of her. It'll be the 3rd year we'll have done this program. It changes every year. This year is especially notable because the day we're doing this is the centenary to the day of the armistice that ended the fighting in World War I.
Greg, the sound is not getting past here.
It's not? No. Okay. Well, come on in then.
So
No, okay, don't come in. I don't know what to do. Turn this up a bit, maybe?
Well, we
It's being turned up, even as we speak. Is that better? Better, better, better.
All right, Greg Williams time. Yay!
Well, I did bring a jacket, but it's just too hot in here, so I see people wearing sweatshirts, and if you want to strip off, go right ahead. It's okay with me. I mean, take your sweatshirts off. Well, it is a marvelous night for a moon dance, but you have chosen to come here, and I appreciate it. This is a great outpouring of support for Edgar Allan Poe, pictured here. You're going to see this slideshow is not going to be coordinated with anything I say. It's just going to be continually looping pictures of Edgar Allan Poe, illustrations of some of his works by a couple of illustrators, and pictures of people who were important in his life. But let's start with a quote, and that would be, "Our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness." Right? Poe didn't say that, it was Vladimir Nabokov. But I still thought it was pretty cool, so I'd start with that. And Poe, it was a little more subtle, and what he did say was this: "The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?" So let's walk those boundaries a little bit. On October 3rd, 1849, a magazine editor in Baltimore named Joseph Evans Snodgrass received a note that read exactly this way: "There is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe." He couldn't just say it's Edgar Poe. He had to say under the cognomen. I love that. 19th century. Can't beat it. "And who appears to be in great distress, and says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance." Not so immediate that I couldn't write out cognomen, but signed, yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker. Ryan's Tavern was located in a building called Gunner's Hall. It was being used as a polling place on October 3rd. It was a congressional election day in Maryland, and Snodgrass had known Poe for years. Now, when Snodgrass arrived at that locality, he saw Poe slumped at a table, surrounded by drinkers, not unlike this evening. And Poe was stupefied with liquor. Now, Poe was typically neatly turned out in a black broadcloth suit with a vest, with a white neckcloth. Not now. He was dirty, his face was bloated, and this gentleman indicated he wore an expression of vacant stupidity. He was dressed in soiled, shabby clothing. He did not have a neckcloth on. He did not have a vest on. His whole dirty, ill-fitting outfit was topped off with a cheap, tatty palm leaf hat that didn't even have a band. So Snodgrass could tell Poe was in bad shape. He was about to rent a room for Poe when Poe's uncle, a gentleman named Henry Herring, arrived. And Snodgrass assumed that Herring was going to take Poe home. Feelings. What is this? What do I have? I asked you to do
They can't hear you out there.
Oh, they
so I'm
can't
trying to
hear?
make it loud.
Oh, okay. Still can't hear? Might turn out to be good, that you can't hear. So I have to hold this and into this?
That's what you're doing.
Okay. And drink my Amontillado. It's not really.
Just ignore me.
All right. Oh, Roger Daltrey. Where was I? Oh, this guy showed up. It was Poe's uncle, and Snodgrass assumed that Herring would take Poe safely home. No, and refused. Poe had apparently once been very abusive and ungrateful to Herring's family. So it was decided that Poe would be taken to a place called Washington College Hospital. The two had to carry Poe to the carriage, which they did. He went to the hospital, and 4 days later, he was dead. He was 40 years old. Edgar Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts. His mother was a famed English-born actor named Elizabeth Arnold. Everyone called her Eliza. She had arrived in the United States in the 18th century, 1796, along with her parents who were also actors. She was orphaned at 11, but as a member of a traveling theatrical troupe, she became very famous and famed as a stage beauty with luminous eyes and raven black hair. When she was 15 years old, she married another actor named Charles Hopkins. She was widowed when she was 18 years old. Hopkins was 20 years old, died of yellow fever. She then met a guy who had been studying to be a lawyer, but then decided to try something with a more reliable income, acting and dancing. And that was Baltimore-born David Poe Jr. So those two were married in 1806. The marriage was a bit on the rocky side because Eliza was very much acclaimed. David was panned by the theatrical critics of the time and became an increasingly bitter alcoholic. They had 3 kids. The first one was named William Henry Leonard Poe, also born in Boston in 1807. He had 3 first names. The next child only had 1 first name, Edgar. Edgar Poe was born on January 19th, 1809. He was born in a boarding house then at 62 Carver Street in Boston. It is now 62 Charles Street South in Boston, a couple of blocks off the Common. It is a parking lot. The house was destroyed in 1962. And then the Poes had a third child, this time a daughter, whose name was Rosalie. But David, who was probably consumptive, which means he had TV, like everybody else in the 19th century, or a lot of people. Before Rosalie was born, David took off, abandoned the family. So, and that was a year before Rosalie was born, so Rosalie was illegitimate. And Eliza was left alone with 3 kids at the age of 22. By 1811, she was in Richmond. She also had tuberculosis consumption. She was still alone, and in December of that year, 1811, and keep in mind, Edgar's about 2 years old at this point, his father, David, died in Norfolk, Virginia. But Eliza had died 3 days earlier. She was 24 years old. Now, in Richmond, the society women had taken on Eliza as a cause, and they now helped place her orphaned children. Each of those 3 children went to a different family. The day after Christmas of that year, Edgar went to live with a couple called John and Frances Allen. John, 31 years old at that time. Frances Valentine Allen was known as Fanny. You'll see her picture come up every once in a while. She was 25. She was clearly the engine behind this whole idea. She really grew attached very quickly to little Eddie. The day he was taken into their home, the day after Christmas of that year, the Richmond Theater burned to the ground, killing 22 people. A theater that his mother had previously performed in. And Edgar would sometimes later claim that his parents, his birth parents, had been killed in that fire. Not true. Now, when Eliza died, though, she left Edgar a watercolor of Boston Harbor. And she wrote on the back of it, "For my little son Edgar, who should ever love Boston, the place of his birth, the theme of his life that will come clear." Oh, I think we're done. Can somebody hit that thing? Did it go all the way through? Where's Corey? Is he actually working? For the library? That's, well, anyway, thank you, Liv. That's my daughter, Liv, who will be able to fix that. So anyway, I hope to have those pictures come back on at some point. Anyway, the last theme of his life that I would mention is his sincere, though sometimes overlapping, devotion to several women. And we will get into that a little bit. Slideshow from beginning. Oh, yeah. God, these technological things are always my downfall. That and the dry ice every time. No, it's really not. Oh, there you go. There's Eddie Poe. Now, when Poe was about 6 years old, the Allens moved to Scotland for a little while, and then they moved to London, and they were there 5 years. You don't think of Edgar Allan Poe as living in England, but he did. 5 years as a kid. Took them 5 weeks to sail over there. The Allens went, some relative of Fanny, at best, really. But she does have luminous eyes, I will say. Anyway, 1820, the Allens are back in the United States. Poe is now 11 years old, and he starts writing poetry when he's a teenager. He always considered himself a poet first. The earliest known lines that he wrote were these that he wrote at the age of 15, and this had to be a slap. He wrote them on one of his foster father's financial sheets. And the lines are these. Last night, with many cares and toils oppressed, weary, I laid me on a couch to rest. Teenager. Or maybe somebody about 68 years old. Before he was 20, he wrote, I could not love except where death was mingling his with beauty's breath. See? Dead women, semi-dead women, all the time. At 16 years old, he entered the University of Virginia, which had been in operation for about a year. They were still trying to figure out what that institution was going to be all about. He left his 15-year-old girlfriend, maybe fiance, Elmira Royston, whom he called Myra, back in Richmond. They planned to marry, but her father intercepted all of his letters to Myra. All of them. All of them. So Poe got there to UVA in March 1826. Thomas Jefferson was still around. He famously died on July 4th of that year, so Poe had 4 months to meet Jefferson, and he probably did, because Jefferson would entertain the students for dinner. So to think of Edgar Allan Poe and Thomas Jefferson, Edgar Allan Poe as a teenager, and Jefferson eating dinner is probably the scariest thing in the whole lecture. Poe lived at number 13 West Range of rooms. You can still stand there at UVA and you can see it. The room that he lived in is glassed off, and you can stand right there and see Poe's dorm room when he was a college kid, and it's still got the dirty laundry and the pizza boxes in it. So it's really something to see. But he was only there for a year. It was big money to go to a university then. Not like now. And cost $350 a year for tuition and board. And John Allen paid for Poe to go to UVA. Sort of. He sent him to Charlottesville with $110. That was not even enough for beers. Never even mind the gambling debts that Edgar accrued trying to keep himself at UVA. He ran up a large sum of gambling debts, probably to the tune of a couple of $1,000s. Now, John Allen's stinginess is especially frustrating since the year before, he was seated at lunch with his uncle, a gentleman named William Galt, when all of a sudden Galt just stiffened up, threw his head back, he was dead. I'm going to get dead in here as often as possible. And he left his estate to John Allen, which at that time was about $750,000. That was a fortune. Call it at least $16 million now. And he can't send this kid to UVA? And no income tax for a guy paying, a guy making $16 million, so no income tax. Again, sort of just like now. Edgar never got much support from John Allen, and despite his high hopes, he got nothing when John Allen died. Not a penny in the will. Even though John Allen had several illegitimate children, they got money, Eddie got nothing. So, but anyway, he can't afford to stay at UVA any longer, so he goes back to the Allens in 1826, but he left in 1827 for Boston. And he enlisted in the Army for 5 years. He was 18 years old. For no apparent reason, he told them he was 22 years old. They would have taken him at 18, but he told them he was 22. And he told them that his name was Edgar A. Perry. Again, no apparent reason. He was posted to Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. Now, you might not imagine that Edgar Allan Poe was a good soldier. He was. Just like you wouldn't imagine that Edgar Allan Poe was athletic. And he was. He once swam against the current in a river for 6 miles. And you wouldn't imagine that he was all that tall, and he wasn't. But he was 5'8", which is not inconsiderable. While he was in Boston, he persuaded a printer to publish his first book, which was called Tamerlane and Other Poems, by, the author's name was given as, a Bostonian. Now, the centerpiece of that book, as you might imagine, was a poem about Tamerlane, whom you all know as the 14th or 15th century Turco-Mongol conqueror. That's what the poem was about. I was guaranteed to sell the book, but it didn't really. They printed 50 copies of it. It had 40 pages. It gathered virtually no notice, sold very few copies then. Now, 12 copies of that book are known to be in existence. One was sold at Christie's auction house in New York in 2009 for $662,500, which Poe would have liked to seen a piece of. But, tellingly, a Poe letter was sold at that same auction for $830,500. So the letter sold more than the book, at that thing anyway. Poe was transferred to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, again, continuing to do very well in the Army. He became a sergeant major, but he was beginning to decide that 5 years was a long time to be in the Army. While he was in the Army, his stepmother, if you will, Fanny, died at the age of 45. And Poe got leave to go to her funeral, but he arrived one day late. Again, not crazy. Even though he was a good soldier, was doing very well, he contrived to get himself into West Point in 1830, where he excelled in languages and writing satirical verses about the officers there. Very popular. He was very popular with the other cadets. But while he was in West Point, John Allen formally disowned him completely. Probably because John Allen had remarried. And his new wife didn't like his illegitimate kids and didn't like Edgar Poe. So that was the end of it. That was the end of their relationship, pretty much. Now it turns out, and I didn't know this, but West Point apparently frowns on cadets not going to class, not going to chapel, and not going to drill. Thought all that was optional, but it turns out no. So Poe at this point is trying to get out of the place, so he thinks, okay, I think I know how to do that. I won't go to class, I won't go to chapel, and I won't go to drill. And sure enough, that worked, and he was court-martialed and expelled from West Point. Interestingly, one of the slides that you'll see is a very much later portrait of Poe. He is wearing his West Point cadet coat when he's in his late 30s. So kicked out of West Point, which was his plan, and he moves on to Baltimore. And he starts living with his paternal aunt, who was a woman named Maria, or Mariah, depending on who you want to listen to, Clem, affectionately known as Muddy. And she has a daughter, who at that time was 8 years old. She is Poe's first cousin, and her name is Virginia Eliza, like Poe's mother, kind of. Clem. Also living there is Poe's brother at that time and his grandmother. And he likes Virginia and he tutors her. And over the next few years, he labored at various magazines doing just about everything. He was a writer, he was an editor, he was setting the type. It was hard work, and he did a lot of it. He wanted American literature to equal British literature. So he wrote a lot of book reviews, and he was merciless. He was known as the Tomahawk Man. Because he just wasn't going to cut anybody any slack. He wanted to raise the level of writing in the U.S., and he thought he was doing his part to do that. While he's toiling away at those various tasks, he eventually gets a letter from Muddy suggesting that Virginia might move into another cousin's house. And that spurred him to ask for Virginia's hand in marriage. He was 27 years old, and she was 13. Now, I know what you're thinking, like me. Right away, you are immediately thinking about Jerry Lee Lewis. But I will point out a couple of distinctions. When Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin, whose name was, this is really freaky, Myra Gail Brown, she was his first cousin once removed, his cousin's daughter, so that's different. And he was 22, not 27. See, it's different. So Poe and Virginia get married. Well, it's a little unclear when they got married, but most people think it was about May of 1836. Now, some writers claim that the fact that Virginia was only 13 years old, by the way, she was almost 14, wasn't all that weird. Besides, it was legal in Virginia. Not required, but legal. But on the marriage license, she gave her age as 22. Same age he gave the Army. Now, you shouldn't think of the union of Edgar and Virginia, or as I like to call them, Eddie and Ginny, as some kind of improper, perverse sexual attraction. It probably really was not that. Poe called her Sissy, and probably thought of her kind of that way, at least for a while, and idealized her, as he did most women. Maybe. That's what we're going to go with tonight anyway. Now, Poe and Virginia and Muddy, they're a unit. They go together, the three of them, everywhere. And at one point they move on to the Bronx, Fordham, actually, which was then rural. And all this time, Poe is writing and publishing poetry. He's writing and publishing stories. And in 1837, he wrote what he later called My Best Tale. Any guesses as to what that was? Anybody know?
Telltale Heart. Telltale Heart.
Raven?
Ligeia. Ligeia. I'm surprised you didn't get that. Anybody ever read that story? Did you say Ligeia? You said Ligeia earlier, didn't you? Oh, you didn't? I thought I heard you say it.
I'll say it.
Well, I was going to say it. Ligeia. So, anybody ever hear of it, other than this young lady? Poe's theory on stories was that they should achieve a unity of effect. So, the plot of this story is not complex. Let me tell you what the plot was.
Yes.
I know some guys got in trouble in Antarctica today for giving away the plots of stories. There was an attempted murder in Antarctica where another guy stabbed another guy because the victim kept telling the other guy how books ended. This was in the Russian station. They stabbed him. That's why I'm getting everybody's permission right up front. I'm going to give you a chance to guess it anyway. So anyway, the narrator of this story, like many of Poe's narrators, is unreliable, possibly. He's an opium addict. And he marries a beautiful raven-haired woman named Ligeia. She has a faultless forehead, like Poe. Like Poe. One of the big things that people always talk about Poe is this huge white forehead. Her eyes are divine orbs. He's obsessed with her, but he's a little vague on how they met. In fact, the story opens, this is the first line of the story, I cannot for my soul remember how, when, or even precisely where I first became acquainted with the lady Ligeia. Maybe it was in some large, old, decaying city near the Rhine. If I meet a woman with divine orbs, this is before my present marriage, if I met her and she was raven-haired and everything, and I met her in a decaying city on the Rhine, wouldn't you remember that? Anyway, she displayed uncanny knowledge of mathematics and science, and then increasingly displaying knowledge of metaphysical and arcane, mystical, forbidden wisdom. Then she died. And grief-stricken, the narrator does what you would expect. He buys an abbey in England. And when he does that, he marries blonde, blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine. He likes her, doesn't love her. 2 months into the marriage, Lady Rowena grows ill, mentally and physically. And one night, he pours her a goblet of wine. He, at the time, is OUI, opium under the influence. And he thinks he sees a ruby-colored fluid fall into Rowena's wine goblet. And a few days later, she dies. And her corpse is shrouded for burial, and this narrator keeps a vigil over her corpse, and he keeps thinking she is reviving. But then she dies again. And this goes on all night. And finally, at dawn, Rowena rises, and the narrator approaches her and touches her, and the shroud falls from her head. She is not Rowena, but I thought you hadn't read it. She's Ligeia. See? Beautiful woman, women really, dying sort of twice, but love never dies. That's Poe's story, and that's the story he thought was the best tale he ever wrote. Now, within the next couple of years comes his only novel, Anyone know what his only novel was?
All of us a mushroom.
No. Surprised you don't know this. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket.
I was gonna say that.
I know you were. I knew that. You probably have a little microfiche of it in your wallet. He also publishes a story called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. You read that one?
Yes.
Remember that one? Remember who the killer was?
Yes.
All right. Now, he called that a tale of ratiocination. Let's say that together. Tale. Tale. Now, everything you read about Poe tells you that this is the first detective story. Says everything you ever read about the guy will tell you that. Now, my old English professor and friend, who, by the way, has been awarded the coveted Edgar Award by the Mystery Writers of America, which is quite prestigious. I asked him to mail it up to me, but he wouldn't, so I could show it to you. And he says that is not so. I won't go into the whole birth of the detective story early in the 19th century, but my friend, Dr. Panic, I know, right? Points out that before Poe was hired as the editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, that very magazine published 2 detective stories written by William Burton. And one was called The Secret Cell, and the other one was called The Cork Leg. Have you read those? No. Nobody has. Those were published in 1837 and 1838, and The Murders in the Rue Morgue were published in 1841. But the Murders in the Rue Morgue are about the murders, the brutal murders. Amazing how graphic this story is, by the way, if you haven't read it recently. When you read it as a teenager, you don't think anything of it, but when you go back and read it now, you think, oh my God, he was writing this stuff in 1841? 2 brutal murders, and then he wrote the sequel in 1842 called The Mystery of Marie Roget, also set in Paris, and that might well be the first fictional murder mystery based on details of an actual murder mystery. A woman named Mary Rogers, get it? Mary Rogers, Marie Roget. She was known as the beautiful cigar girl of New York. She was found floating in the Hudson River near Hoboken. Now, why he wanted to change the scene from Hoboken to Paris, I don't know, but he did, and that was the case that that story was based upon. He also, that year, published, or a couple of years later, I should say, published a poem called The Raven. Have you heard of that? Yes. Okay. Now, how did Poe light upon a raven? How did he decide upon that as a subject about which to write a poem? The theory is Charles Dickens. Dickens owned a pet raven called Grip, G-R-I-P. Actually, Dickens was a serial Grip the Raven owner. He had 3 ravens named Grip. But this was the first one. And the first one, Grip, was the inspiration for the talking raven companion of the protagonist in his novel Barnaby Rudge. Talking raven in that book, owned by Barnaby Rudge. And that raven said things like, I'm a devil, I'm a devil, I'm a devil. Can you do better? Can anybody do better right now? I didn't even practice that. And he also said stuff like, grip the clever, grip the wicked, grip the knowing. But the favorite phrase of the real Grip was, hello, old girl. But that didn't fly in the novel, so he had this other stuff about the devil and all that. And indeed, when the real Grip died, his last words were, hello, old girl. Now, Poe reviewed Dickens very favorably, even though he was British, several times. And when he reviewed Barnaby Rudge, he described Grip as intensely amusing. So he clearly liked this raven idea. Charles Dickens came to the United States in 1842, and Dickens and Poe met in Philadelphia. And Poe, at that time, was delighted to learn that the raven in Barnaby Rudge was based on a real raven. A few years later, one of the great writers of the mid-19th century in America, James Russell Lowell, wrote about this in a couplet that goes like this. There comes Poe with his raven, like Barnaby Rudge. 3/5 of him genius, and 2/5 sheer fudge. Now, there have been 2 grips among the ravens at the Tower of London. You know about the ravens at the Tower of London. Interestingly and coincidentally, there was an article in the New Yorker dated yesterday about the gentleman who was the Raven Master at the Tower of London. Doesn't mention grip, but there is a grip too at the Tower of London right now. And I mention this only so I can tell you the favorite treat of the ravens who live at the Tower of London. Dog biscuits dipped in blood. By the way, you know that a group of crows is called a murder, right? You know what 2 crows are called? Attempted murder. Did you get that on the film? Do you know what a group of ravens is called? It has 2 names. An unkindness or a conspiracy. Now, all this while, a couple of themes are overarching Poe's life. He has an unusually low tolerance for alcohol. Not like this gentleman. So, every once in a while, he will have, he'll walk by a glass of wine and become completely intoxicated, and he'll be out of it for days. Seriously, he would be incapacitated. That happened to him a number of times. Also, tragically at this time, Virginia has consumption, tuberculosis, which of course is progressive. So after a very rough 1846, Poe himself was ill during that time. He was depressed, suffering his and his family's usual poverty. Virginia died at the end of January 1847. She was 24 years old. Poe himself fell gravely ill at that time and was nursed by the unfailingly loyal and attentive Muddy. The next year, Poe is speaking in Lowell when he falls into love, or at least like, with a woman named Mrs. Nancy Richmond, who he calls Annie. She becomes his confidant, and then fairly soon after that, he's in Providence, and he proposes to a 45-year-old widowed poet named Sarah Helen Whitman, but that engagement is broken in December. These relationships become pretty well known. And then finally in 1849, he leaves for Richmond. He is seeking Southern support for the magazine that he is planning called The Stylus. And we start the tale of his final days in 1849, starting in Richmond. Having returned to Richmond, he reconnects with his high school sweetheart, or at least the sweetheart of his teenagehood, Elmira Royston. Myra Royston, now called Elmira Royston Shelton. Turned out that after her father had sabotaged her romance with Poe, she got married at the age of 17 to a guy named Shelton. But she was widowed in 1844, and she inherited from her husband quite a bit of money, so she was doing very well. So now Eddie and Myra get engaged, or not, depending on who you asked and when you asked that question. And they were maybe supposed to be married on October 17th, 1849. Some members of her family did not favor her union with Edgar Allan Poe, particularly her 2 kids, whose names were Anne and Southall. They were firmly against her marrying Poe. Her 3 brothers were definitely against her marrying Poe, probably because of the rumors of Poe's numerous other relationships with women, those two I told you about in particular, and the belief that Poe wanted to marry Elmira because she had a lot of money, and that would certainly help launch a magazine. There was also the drinking, which was talked about a lot. Poe thought he cured that issue by joining a group called the Sons of Temperance in Richmond. So on September 26th, he's visiting Elmira in her Grace Street Richmond home. The evening before he was leaving for 2 weeks to go to Philadelphia to edit a poetry volume written by a Mrs. Loud, for which he was going to be paid $100. Fair amount of money. He figured, pretty good deal. I don't have to do a lot of work. $100, it's well worth it. Myra thought that Poe was feverish. She questioned, do you really have to go to Philadelphia early the next morning? And he indicated, of course, that he did. There was $100 calling his name in Philadelphia. To go there from Richmond, there's a morning boat, and then a 6-hour train trip, so it's kind of a big deal. He left Elmira about 9 o'clock that night. He walked to a place called Sadler's Restaurant, and on the way there, he stopped to visit a doctor named Dr. John Carter. And he sat talking to Carter. We don't really know what went on there. He might have gotten some medicines or something from Carter. But while he's in Carter's office, he is playing with Carter's Malacca sword cane. Everybody know what that is? It's a cane with a sword in it. So he was in there about 20 minutes, and he left his own cane, and he took the doctor's.
Oh,
He got to Sadler's around 10 o'clock at night, and he sat there for a couple of hours with some guys, and he left there in good spirits and sober. And he was staying at a place called the Swan, which was about a 20-minute walk away, and he got back there about 1 o'clock in the morning. The boat was that he was going to take, at least the first boat to get down the James River, was leaving a place called Rocket's Landing at 5:30. So he makes that, he gets down the James into the Hampton Roads off of Norfolk by about 3 o'clock the afternoon, and the passengers would then transfer to a large bay steamer, and that would take them overnight to Baltimore. So a lot of trouble for $100. But they're, cost you $6 one way. So he does that, and he gets to Baltimore about 6 o'clock in the morning on the 28th of September. And this is where things get really misty, foggy, and hazy, just like dry ice was supposed to do, but didn't. So he apparently got on the train to Philadelphia. He might have panicked for some reason, turned around back to Baltimore. Now, reportedly, there is a weird episode that happens to Poe in 1849 that might have happened in July, but it maybe makes more sense that it happens now, in the last couple of days of September. Or it might have happened nowhere but inside Poe's mind. But the story is that he got off the Philadelphia train somewhere, maybe in Havre de Grace, Maryland, or Bordentown, Pennsylvania, to elude two men on the train who he had overheard plotting to kill him. And then all of a sudden, somehow in Philadelphia, he is thrown in jail. Is he arrested? We don't know. Is he charged with any crime? We don't know. Is he put into protective custody? We don't know. He referred in a letter later to something called mania a patu, which generally means delirium tremens. But in any event, he's incarcerated in a prison just outside of Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, called Moya Mensing. If he was there at all, he was there. That prison, by the way, has been destroyed. It was destroyed in 1968. If he was incarcerated there, he was their most famous inmate. However, briefly he stayed there. If he was not there, then their most famous inmate was a gentleman named Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, who is sometimes, surely erroneously, called the first serial killer in the United States. He was the proprietor of what was known as the Murder Castle during Chicago's 1893 World's Fair. It is known that he murdered at least 9 people. The estimates are that he murdered between 20 and 200 people. He was from New Hampshire. By the way, this came to me only a week or so ago. Do you know the song, "Oh Beautiful for Spacious Skies"? Would you like to sing it? Because I wouldn't. But anyway, it was written by Catherine Lee Bates, who's from Falmouth. And she's got a phrase in there, "Alabaster Cities." That phrase refers to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. So Catherine Lee Bates tied forever and ever with H.H. Holmes. There's a book in there, I'm telling you right now. H.H. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing prison in 1896 at the age of 34, and of course they botched his execution. When you hang a person, you know, you're supposed to have a knot placed just so behind his bone and everything, and snap their neck. It didn't work with him, so he was strangled and he was dangling there. They didn't pronounce him dead for about 20 minutes. And apparently not that many people were all that choked up about it. So Poe's in the prison, and he reportedly experiences in this prison, even though he was only there maybe a day, if he was there at all, an eerie, prolonged vision. A radiant woman questioned him. Then she transmogrified. Yes, transmogrified. That's almost as good a word as cognomen. Transmogrified into a black bird calling itself cholera. Catchy. The bird picked up Poe and flew over the city of Philadelphia, and then returned him to the prison. And back in the prison, Poe observed guards cutting off the legs, section by section, of Muddy. Now, this was a woman who was pretty good to him, but she appears in his vision. So eventually, prison personnel recognized Poe as the Raven guy, and which is pretty impressive before the dissemination of widespread photography. So they fine him, nobody knows for what, because I don't think he was even criminally charged with anything, but anyway, he threw down some money somewhere and he was released. And he fled to the home of an editor friend with a story of having been followed by threatening men. And this guy asked him, well, who would want to harm you? And Poe said it was for revenge. And the guy said, revenge for what? And Poe said, well, a woman trouble. No elaboration. Then he tried to shave his mustache off, but the editor clipped it off with scissors because he didn't want to give Poe any sharp instruments. But what happened next? No one knows. But somehow he ends back up in Baltimore. He ends up in Orion's, and then he ends up in the hospital. And there, the mystery continued. He's in Washington College Hospital in Baltimore, and he's attended by a Dr. John Joseph Moran. And during the time he's in the hospital, having been taken over from that polling place, he alternates between unconsciousness and wild delirium. He sees and talks to imaginary beings in the room and on the wall. And at one point he calls out, Reynolds, Reynolds. Nobody's ever been able to figure out who that was supposed to be. He never related what had happened to him the previous 4 days. And during his lucid period there in the hospital, someone tried to soothe him. They said, well, you'll soon be well, you'll still be back with your friends. And he said, The best thing my best friend could do would be to blow out my brains with a pistol. And then finally, on October 7th, he's apparently resting comfortably, and all of a sudden he breathed, "Lord, help my poor soul," and he died. Of what? Poe once wrote, "I often thought I could hear the sound of darkness as it stole across the horizon, rushing toward me." Theories of what finally brought Poe and the darkness together are many. A few of them: carbon monoxide and mercury. Carbon monoxide from coal gas and mercury from calomel, mercury chloride, which was prescribed to ward off, no, cholera, the black bird. This theory is largely discredited. The tests of Poe's hair were inconclusive for heavy metals from coal gas, and probably not enough mercury to be considered mercury poisoning. What's the next thing? Phrenitis, swelling of the brain. That was the cause of death given on the death certificate. Might have died of encephalitis or meningitis. Could have died from the flu, which turned into pneumonia. There is some evidence, as I mentioned, that before he left Richmond, he was ill. Elmira didn't think he should travel. He visited Dr. Carter. Might have had some kind of high fever that might explain some of his hallucinations and disorientation. Another big theory, rabies. In 1996, at a clinical pathology conference, doctors were presented, without giving a name, presented with the symptoms that we can identify him as having suffered from. Lethargy, disorientation, followed by hallucinations, great variations in pulse rate, almost panting breathing, and a median time of survival after onset of symptoms, 4 days. Dr. R. Michael Benitez made the diagnosis that this was rabies, which was not rare in the 19th century. But no evidence of an animal bite and no hydrophobia. Brain tumor. When Poe was disinterred from his grave after 26 years, and we'll get to this in a little while, the guy picked up his skull, and there was something rolling around in his skull. And of course the papers at the time said, well, that was Poe's brain rolling around in his skull. Well, the problem with that is that brains deliquesce fairly soon after death. They just liquefy. But if he had a brain tumor, then that might have calcified. Supposedly a doctor once told Poe that he had a lesion on his brain, which is what rendered him so highly susceptible to alcohol. And it might also explain his sometimes erratic behavior. Alcohol. Problem, obviously, for Poe. He could not handle it. His close friends, when they learned that he had died, they immediately assumed that he had died from the effects of some alcoholic debauch. Dr. Moran said that there was no evidence that he had been drinking alcohol at all. But Snodgrass, the guy who responded to the note, who was a teetotaler, he turned Poe's death into an object lesson and a lecture topic illustrating the evils of alcohol. So the evidence on alcohol is diametrically opposed from those two gentlemen. Cooping. Cooping was a method, this will probably come into play next week. Cooping was a method of obtaining votes for a political candidate. A gang would kidnap somebody, a man, because women weren't voting, come on. Disguise him and force him through alcohol, either by making him really drunk or at least offering as a reward, and also violence, to go from ward to ward, voting multiple times. And they called it cooping because for at least a period of time, they would imprison people in a cellar. at least for a while, and you know, they make them look different, so they switch clothes. And the reason this theory probably came about is because Poe was so uncharacteristically dressed when Snodgrass finally came to his assistance. This theory, which didn't even surface till the 1870s, accounts, though, for the clothes Poe was wearing at that time. Beating. There are some people who think he was just roughed up by random ruffians, that he had been drinking with some friends that he had known at West Point. They had persuaded him to drink. He drank a little bit, got completely shattered, and went out to the streets. He was rough, just left in the street all night. Cold night, unusually and unseasonably cold. But there is scant, if any, evidence of marks of violence on his body. Clearly the best theory, or at least the most fulfilling theory to talk about, even though it is not really accepted by serious scholarship, is that Poe was murdered. And this was articulated in a 2000 book called Midnight Dreary, The Mysterious Death of Edgar Allan Poe, by a writer called John Evangelist Walsh. It explains Poe's clothing and a few other items of evidence, so it's at least plausible. As far as I'm concerned, it's the winner, at least in terms of speculative fun. So the story is that Poe left Elmira in Richmond. She had expected him to be back in about 2 weeks. Maybe they were supposed to marry on October 17th. You remember that I said she had 3 brothers. They had heard about him, didn't like him, did not want him marrying their sister. So, in this theory, they were on the train with him, at least 2 of them were. They finally got to him in Baltimore. They did not beat him to death, but they forcibly filled him up with liquor and left him in the streets. So, again, this explains his rambling about being followed. It explains his statement about having a woman problem and the odd clothes he was found in. The theory being he bought those clothes as a disguise just after he tried to shave his mustache off. So, who knows? Nobody knows for sure. I'm sorry if you came here expecting a definitive answer. I'm happy to give you one, but those are the sort of prevailing. Those are the prevailing theories about the death of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, after Muddy learned of Poe's death, of course, she was really shattered by the whole thing. Not in the same sense he might have been, but she was really destroyed. She returned to the house in New York, and she discovered that Poe's beloved cat, whose name was Katerina, had died. Now, I like this because if you know about the Day of the Dead, you know who Katerina is. Unfortunately, Katerina did not come about until about 1910, 1913, through the woodcuts of Jose Guadalupe Posada. Katerina is the skeleton with the big hat. And you will see her all the time now. You will see her in parade, you know, with the skull candy face and the big hat. Her name's Katerina. Poe's cat was also named Katerina. I see a book. Even though they're spelled different, he spelled his cat's name with 2 T's. Katerina, the Mexican lady, only has 1 T in her name. Okay, now the hospital where he went and where he died, it still exists. It's now a residence. It's not known for sure exactly where his death room was. His funeral was the day after he died. It was a gray, raw Monday, October 8th, 1849. And he was buried in the rear of what was called Westminster Burying Ground, which is weird because there wasn't a church there until 3 years after that. The church was sort of built on after the burial ground already existed. The number of attendees at Edgar Allan Poe's funeral was probably in the neighborhood of 8 people. And the funeral lasted 3 minutes. And he was buried next to his, the grandparents on the Poe side. He was buried next to his brother Henry. You remember my mention of him. He died of tuberculosis in 1831 at the age of 24, just like their mother, and just like Virginia. There was no headstone. The sexton of the place was a guy named George Spence. He eventually placed a small sandstone block over Edgar Allan Poe's gravesite that had engraved on it the number 80. Nobody knows why. It's probably just laying around. Picked up on there. About 10 years later, his cousin Nielsen Poe bought a gravestone that reportedly read, "Here at last he is happy." But that gravestone was destroyed when a train went off the rails and smashed through the carver's yard. Here at last he is happy, you know. But in 1875, Poe's remains, and also those of Muddy, she had died in 1871 at the age of 80, were exhumed because there was going to be a new memorial placed in a prominent spot in that cemetery. But, so they dug them up. And when they dug up Poe's cheap coffin, it kind of came apart. And Spence was there and some other guys. And so they looked in. And Poe was now a skeleton in perfect condition, though his ribs had collapsed and his upper teeth had shaken loose during the moving. But his lower teeth were pearly white. So this guy Spence, that's when he lifts up the head, and in Spence's words, his brain rattled around inside, just like a lump of mud, sir. But probably wasn't. Now the coffin, minus a few pieces, which people took as collector's items, was placed inside a wooden case and reburied. And this time, in 1875, the cemetery draws a lot of people, including Walt Whitman. And there is now a memorial marker with a bas-relief raven, although the tip of the beak has been knocked off or came off. And I wasn't going to say this, but just like Oscar Wilde's penis is knocked off that statue in Paris, it's very similar. That was in another talk. That was in a talk about the Père Lachaise Cemetery, so just kidding. Anyway, there's that marker there with the raven on it. That was placed there in 1913 at the site of the original grave. It's been moved around a little bit as they think they found more accurately where it was, but that's where the original grave is. Now, what about Virginia? She died, as I mentioned, in 1847 after 5 years of tuberculosis, and she was buried in Fordham, New York. But part of the cemetery where she lay was being, I don't know how to, I don't think you can tear down a cemetery, but that's kind of what they were doing. They were moving everybody. And in 1883, there was an early Poe biographer named William Fearing Gill, who apparently just happened to be there when the sexton of that cemetery had Virginia's bones on a shovel. And they were just about to toss them away, and Gill said, "I'll take those." And he did, and he put Virginia's bones in a box, which he hid under his bed. Eventually, he gave those up, and she was reburied on Poe's left side. Muddy is on his right side in the grave in 1885 on what would have been Poe's 76th birthday. Now, the sexton who had first buried Poe was present for all of this, all of these reburials. He lived in the catacombs of the church, and that's where he committed suicide. I love this stuff. Now, one of the things that I wanted to tell you, and this is the last thing really until we get to the quiz. There is a quiz, and I'm not kidding. You may have heard of this gentleman. His name was, well, they don't know his name for sure, but he was called the Poe Toaster. Anybody ever hear of that? The Poe toaster was somebody starting in the 1930s. Was a man dressed in a cloak with a hat, had a walking stick, and he would visit the original site of Poe's grave in Baltimore. And he would bring with him a bottle of quite expensive cognac.
Yes.
And he would pour out a glass of the cognac, he would toast Poe with that glass, and he would leave at the gravesite the remainder of the cognac in the bottle and 3 roses. Had to be in Baltimore, which is actually pronounced Balmer. This went on, again, it was believed this was started in the 1930s. There was a note left in 1993 to the effect that the torch will be passed. And this person, presumed to be a man, was never identified, and they believe he died in the 1990s, and they believe that he had 2 sons who alternated this task for several years. But the last time it has genuinely happened was in 2009. And in 2012, the tradition, which has been tracked by the Poe Society of Baltimore, was declared over. And anyone trying to do this cognac and roses routine since 2012 is dubbed a faux toaster. And you are scorned by the Poe Society of Baltimore, among many other people. And so let's not be faux toasters, but let's be Poe toasters. Does anybody still have a glass with them or a piece of pie they want to raise in there? I'm sensing not, so I'll do it. Edgar Allan Poe, forever. Now, we're not done, because I told you there's going to be a quiz, and there is. Now, you are looking at this, and you're thinking, well, that's a mug, and it has a picture of Edgar Allan Poe on it. But it also has a lot of quotations on it. And we're going to find out who's the real Poe aficionado in this group. Because you're going to tell me where these quotes come from. Now, the first one is, and mostly it's an excuse just to throw a few Poe quotes. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. Anybody know for sure where that's from? It's from a poem called A Dream Within a Dream. I might want to guess on some of these. All right. The next one is from a proud tower in the town, death looks gigantically down. Anybody know that one? Nope, it's from a poem called The City in the Sea. Anybody know that poem? Yes. Me neither. This one you might get. This one's bells, 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 bells. Poe scholars, everyone. You might get this one too. Quoth the raven. A picture of a raven. Nevermore. What's the title of that poem? Raven. I heard somebody say nevermore. That's not the title. All right. You might get this one. The moon never beams without bringing me dream.
Annabelle Lee.
Wow.
My favorite poem.
Come on up. You want to recite it? Well, let me finish the quote at least. The moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabelle Lee. All right. This next one you will get for sure. I became insane with huge intervals of horrible sanity.
Telltale Heart.
Any other? No. It's from a letter he wrote to a guy called George W. Eveleth on January 4th, 1848. I'm surprised you didn't get that one. Right, this one you'll get. There's a clue on this one. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato. I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. Cast of the mouth. Okay, let me see. Then there's a picture. Now we get to the other side of the mug. This isn't easy. I haven't hold his microphone. Well, this is a good one. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Mask of the Red Death. By the way, and I didn't mention this because it's not in my notes, and I may be making it up, but the year he was born, 1809, the city of Boston banned the wearing of masks at balls. And the year he died, 1849, they widened that ban to say that you couldn't have such a ball. You couldn't sponsor or put on such a ball. Doesn't say that on this mug. All right, let me see. To observe attentively is to remember distinctly. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul.
Happy birthday.
No, but there's a birthday card. And you're right. That's the black cat. There's only a few more, bear with me. This is a good one. A dirge for her, the doubly dead, in that she died so young. No takers on that one? Lenore. This is another good birthday one. Even in the grave, all is not lost. The pit and the pendulum. And finally, tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. And that's the end. Anybody have any questions about Oscar Wilde? Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you. It's like all those 19th century writers. Herman Melville.